Most Appalachian folklorists and storytellers begin their tale of the Gouge bombing by describing the 1937 killing of Arnold Tallet. Now, what I want to do is rewind the clock back to 1935 and shine the spotlight on John Calhoun Swafford, who was in his early 80s. He's buried here behind me. And I want to tell his story because I feel that some of the details about his killing might show the state of Tennessee very well could have killed an innocent man. By the time he was killed in 1935, J. Calhoun Swafford was witness to a previous family feud dating back to the Civil War, when a Swafford family member joined a Union bushwhacking outfit and killed after torturing an elderly member of the Tallet family. This feud continued up until the very early 1900s, when several people were killed in continued fighting. However, things died down, and the Tallet and Swafford families married into each other, and things seemed to be doing pretty well for a little while. By 1935, he was 81, 82 years old. The Great Depression was here, but these families had been in the county for a very long time, so the Swaffords especially, and their patriarch was J. Calhoun, they were doing pretty well. They owned hundreds of acres of land, and he was a cattleman. And then people started to cattle rustle. This was sort of a trend of the Great Depression. You had people like Bonnie and Clyde, Babyface Nelson, and the Barker Carpus gang robbing folks who they felt didn't deserve the money. And although everybody in America was suffering, a lot of people in Appalachia felt that they were struggling, especially so because the infrastructure here was almost non-existent. So people began to take issue with the Swaffords, and this cattle rustling literally degenerated to people just riding past properties he owned on the border of Bledsoe and Rhea County and just shooting his cows. This was personal. At least if you steal a cow, you can resell it and provide for your family. This was just a jab at the Swaffords. Now, the situation with the cattle rustling got so bad that J. Calhoun Swafford hired his friend Coleman Johnson, described in the papers as a cowboy World War I veteran. The two men received an anonymous call at around 8:30 p.m. on September 2nd, 1935, warning them that another cattle raid was to take place up on the ridge on the county line. They both got into a pickup truck and drove up to the ridge and were both shot in the head with a .45 revolver. Local farmers would speak to the police, and this would be reported in the press that apparently the two men had walked up to a vehicle with 3 people in it. One of them was a man incredibly central to the story of the Gouge bombing, Church Lester. He was flanked by 2 very young women, and words were exchanged. The man who witnessed this, he didn't really hear what was said. All he knew was that the situation quickly escalated when Church Lester pulled out a revolver and shot both men in the head, fleeing the scene of the crime. So there you have it. Police immediately knew their main suspect was Church Lester, who came from a prominent moonshining family and seemed to have a pretty well-known beef with John Calhoun Swafford. They took off after his vehicle, firing several shots into it, but he managed to evade them, escaping up into the mountains. And then a couple of days later, after being tracked down with bloodhounds and still managing to evade the police, he shows up in town and says, "I've been trying to surrender for the last 2 days. Allow me to explain myself. This was only self-defense. When the police went chasing after me, I didn't recognize those as police vehicles because they were deputy vehicles. I thought Swafford's family was trying to kill me, and every time I have run away from law enforcement, it was just me running away from what I thought was his family. I fully intend to obey the law, and I'll turn myself in right here and now." So for the 2 days that Church Lester was on the run for the shooting of J. Calhoun Swafford in 1935, all of eastern Tennessee followed the story. See, the Lester family were very well known for their bootlegging antics, and whereas most farmers actually took part in it, it seems like the Lesters were making it their main thing, and they were very well known as outdoorsmen and survivalists. You had bloodhounds chasing him through the mountains where the trail would disappear at a cabin, and then for him to show up 2 days later raised everybody's eyebrows. And this is the original Bledsoe County Jail. Many of the main figures from Bloody Bledsoe would find themselves behind these bars. Opened in 1851, it saw the Civil War and was only replaced in 2011 with a new facility elsewhere in town. If you pay close attention to this county jail, you'll see a plaque up here lists the facade as being constructed in 1937, the same year as the bombing, and you'll see Sure enough, Sheriff W.L. Walling was killed in a shootout in 1944. Now, I was not expecting to see this. Tennessee, homegrown. I'm going to be doing a video eventually on the Cornbread Mafia, but you can see bongs, people who were in this jail up until 2011 when they made a new one. Free on the inside, but not on the outside. And here's the old door. Safely behind the bars of the county jail, away from any would-be Swafford family assassins, Church Lester is free to give his version of events to the detectives. Now, what he says is that he was up on the ridge with two teenage women. They were all wearing caps, and this actually was proven by evidence. They found those caps in his car. And up rolls the elderly Swafford and his young World War I veteran cowboy. They're immediately aggressive towards the three in the car, and it seems like they're beginning to make moves against the young women. And when he said, "You better back off," they began getting aggressive towards him, and when one of them reached for something, Church Lester pulled out his .45 revolver and shot both of them square in the head. Now, because of this, he was acquitted. There was actually evidence, and someone had witnessed this fight, although they didn't hear any spoken words, but the two women next to him both testified in his favor and said exactly what he did. These two men, led by the elderly Swafford, came up there, caused a fight, and got shot. So reluctantly, the authorities here in the county had to release Church Lester, and not a lot of people were happy about this. So this caused bad blood between the Swafford family and the Lester clan. Now, earlier on in the video, I said that most narratives of the Gouge bombing begin with the story of Arnold Tallet, who was 32 years old when he was killed in self-defense by a man named James Harmon Gouge, the father of the three girls who died in the attack. Now, to tell his story, you need to understand that Gouge was a businessman and had about a 50% stake in a tavern between Hampton and Valley Forge over in Carter County at the opposite end of eastern Tennessee. However, Arnold had quite a few friends and family over here, and he and Gouge had a sort of back and forth relationship. Oftentimes their personalities clashed, and finally Harmon approached him in February 1937 with a proposition. Either I buy out your share, or I get legal action filed against you so that I can be sole owner of this tavern. Naturally, this angered Arnold. It was the Great Depression and work was hard to come by, and he pulled out a knife. Well, Harmon always carried a gun with him, and he shot the 32-year-old Tallet boy dead. He was eventually acquitted by reason of self-defense, and he figured that it was over and done with, but the thing was, the Tallet family was very influential in Bledsoe County, and not only was the Tallet family very important here, you also had the Swaffords from the feuding of decades earlier. See, Arnold's mother was Amanda, maiden name Swafford, and his father was Major Tallet. So the entire family was pretty distraught at the fact that this businessman got off free in Carter County. Having been acquitted of the murder of Arnold Tallet, Harmon and his wife Pauline were now free to raise their three young daughters, Sonia, Luena, and Roma Jean, ages 9, 7, and 5. They felt that everything was now behind them, and they knew that Arnold's family mostly lived over in Bledsoe County, so they didn't think that anything would come of it. But very sadly, they were very, very wrong. See, in November of 1937, Harmon's car exploded while he walked inside the gas station convenience store. When police came to investigate, they found that someone had placed half a dozen sticks of dynamite under the radiator in the hopes that it would detonate while he was on the road. In reality, he was only on the road for a couple of minutes and pulled into the station, and that is when the heat got it. So he realized someone was out to kill him, and Harmon decided to check into a hotel in Johnson City. He was probably thinking that whoever wanted him dead lived in the local area and would know through word of mouth that he was no longer at his family home and they wouldn't target his wife and kids. However, the folks who did end up killing him were from Bledsoe and didn't really have many connections in the local area, so they still felt he was home on the night of January 7th when they detonated the house, placing dynamite on all three corners and lighting it off through a fuse that went from the basement over to the home across the road in the very early hours of the morning. So thorough was the explosion in the pre-dawn hours of January 7th, 1938, that the three Gouge girls were thrown against the ceiling with enough force to collapse their lungs. Two died instantly and the third on the way to the hospital, while their mother Pauline remained in a coma for quite some time. The entirety of the Southeast was gripped with a desire to apprehend whoever might be responsible, and investigators very soon found a folded up receipt from the Agnes Hardware Company on a bridge close to where the home was bombed. They also knew that Arnold Tallet had been killed a year prior by Harmon in a case of self-defense, so they began to connect the dots. They went down to the hardware store, they showed photos, they asked, "Have you seen any of these boys?" And almost immediately, White Miller Tallet, the coroner of Bledsoe County and Arthur's brother, was brought in for the murder, as was his other brother, Crave Tallet, who was a sheriff's deputy. Along with this, you had Ulysses Walling, another deputy, and a relative of the sheriff, Walling, who the sheriff himself was killed in a shootout in 1944, and a man named Lee Walker, who was also a sheriff's deputy. After a few days, they also apprehended Church Lester, the son of a retired minister. We've talked a little bit about him. I feel that his involvement was tangential at best. You also had a couple of Arnold's other siblings, for example his sister, who were accused of aiding the crime before it occurred. And as the authorities began to piece things together, the case was made pretty clear. The trial progressed in a fairly unusual way, and that's because the only two men who confessed to being present for the bombing were Lee Walker and Ulysses Walling. The other two men who were actually sentenced to die in the chair were Church Lester, who again, it must be said, proclaimed his innocence and had a retired minister for a father who firmly established his ally along with other people in the community of Frostbite, and White Miller Tallet, who proclaimed his innocence up until the very end. Now, as we remember, Lester committed suicide in his cell shortly before his execution date, and White Miller said that he didn't do it as he was being led to the chair. Now you're probably wondering, why do I think Church Lester very well could have been framed for the murder of those three little girls? I'm not 100% positive on my claims, but I think nowadays enough of a doubt exists that they would have stayed his execution and given him life in prison. I think the answer goes back to that murder of the elderly J. Calhoun Swafford several years earlier in 1935, for which he was acquitted. Now, the police immediately assumed that the Tullett brothers of the murdered Arnold boy, who was killed a year prior to the bombing, would want revenge. And they were right in their assumption and pretty quickly arrested them after evidence accumulated. This was on January 7th. It wouldn't be until February 28th that Church Lester was brought in, and the whole time he spoke, he said, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I was never involved with this, and I was actually up at the community of Frostbite. I was going to a Tennessee Valley Authority event. And other people were there who saw me. People witnessed this." He then said, "I went back to my father's cabin, and his father, who's buried right over here, also corroborated this." However, he was still sentenced to die, and very sadly, he would take his own life in prison rather than face Old Sparky. So you may be asking, why would the Tullett brothers accuse a man who wasn't with them of the crime when he wasn't there just for the murder of a man who wasn't related to their family? After all, they were Tulletts, and Lester killed a Swafford several years earlier. Well, their mother, Amanda, was born to the Swafford family. I can't find any information on who her father was, but I think that even if it wasn't her father that was killed by Lester in 35, they would have fought for their family name anyway. Buried in front of us are Church Lester's parents. On the left is his father, Francis Marion Lester, and on the right is his mother, Mary. As Church said to investigators, on the night of January 6th, he realized that his son hadn't come home from the Frostbite school, so he journeyed up to the community and went to go pick him up. But when he saw that a Tennessee Valley Authority event was taking place, he sort of decided to hang around. The event went on to the hours of the early morning, when he went over to his father Francis's cabin and spent the rest of the day of the 7th with them. Church's father, Francis, actually backed up his claim and said, yeah, he was at the cabin all day with me on the 7th, and his kids were there. There were also people who saw Church Lester up in the community of Frostbite at the TVA event. The state, however, used testimony by Lee Walker as official evidence. See, Walker and Tullett both claimed that at 3 or 4 a.m., Church got in a car with them and a man named Ulysses Walling, who was a relative of the sheriff at the time. Walker and Tullett both claimed that they then drove to the opposite side of the eastern part of Tennessee and planted the bomb in the early hours of the morning. However, Church Lester said, I would never get into a car with Lee Walker. The court demanded to know why, and it was very reluctant, but he did say, Lee was indecent with one of my little cousins. And I think it's a very sad sign of the times of the 1930s in Appalachia that this, according to the newspapers, caused all of the jurors to break out in laughter. I think it's pretty clear looking back that Church Lester, if you're to believe what he says and the evidence from his father, Frank, buried there to the right, as well as to other people in the community of Frostbite who saw him at the TVA event, that he was just picking his son up from school and stayed there for several hours, then went to go hang out with his father on the day of the 7th. He seemed to have a pretty rock-solid alibi, and although one of the relatives of Sheriff Walling was sentenced only to years in prison and not to die, for some reason, they decided to execute Church Lester, and he maintained his innocence up until he took his own life in prison. He didn't want to be executed by the state. Not a lot of people are alive who remember the story of the Gouge family bombing, but if you look back at contemporary newspapers, you'll see this story made national headlines and that exposed the fact that Arthur Tollett had a lot of well-connected family here in Bledsoe County. One of those men that was close with the Tollett family was the sheriff buried here behind me, Walter Lee Walling. Now, pretty immediately after the bombing, the sheriff of Carter County, J.M. Moreland, issued a warrant, and he coordinated with the Bledsoe County Justice of the Peace to arrest Walter Walling, the sheriff of the county. And he did this because he said, everybody in Carter County has been telling you to pull certain witnesses for the trial, to arrest certain people, and it seemed like Sheriff Walling just didn't have any interest in arresting certain members of his family, certain acquaintances that might be connected with the bombing of those 3 little girls. Now, eventually he would be acquitted along with some other members of his family, but he would die in 1944 in a shootout involving his ex-wife. See, 4 years before he would be implicated in the Gouge bombing, all the way back in 1933, his first wife, Benji Nellie, would pass away. She was his first love, and very young, only 23 years old. So for a while, it seems like Walling fell into a cycle of depression, but quickly married a local woman named Ann Smith. By most accounts, they had a beautiful relationship, and he was a very good husband. However, during the trial, his name was dragged through the mud, and he became something of a national celebrity, and his wife would get a divorce. By 1944, she was living in the family home of a man named Henry Gill. Henry actually had a wife, but it seems like she was living there more or less to get away from the Walling family. And in late October 1944, the former sheriff would get very drunk, summon his 12-year-old son, grab a shotgun, and walk up to Henry's home, demanding to see his wife. Well, Henry said, "Get off my property," and Walling said, "I'll kill you and your family." He fired a shot which wounded and would eventually claim the life of his second wife, Ann Smith, and was engaged in a gunfight which would result in his death on the front lawn of the Gill home. And Sheriff Walling is buried in the Sites Cemetery in Van Buren County, named after some early immigrants. But this has also got a number of Wallings, including Daniel Walling, who was an early pioneer here and a descendant of the sheriff. Behind me is the grave of 33-year-old Deputy Sheriff Wesley Dunn, who was killed in an altercation when he was trying to arrest a member of the Swafford family on January 25th, 1915. This man's name was Eastland Swafford, who papers reported was the brother of Charlie Swafford, also in prison for life for murdering an itinerant salesman. If we trace the Dunn family back through Wesley Dunn, his father was the son of Hillis McVeigh Dunn. And this is Deputy Wesley Dunn's father, Henry Dunn, the son of Hillis McVeigh Dunn, who was killed in the Swafford-Tollett feud. And this is Susan Dunn, who has on her epitaph, wife of Hillis McVeigh Dunn, her son, is buried over here, along with her grandson, who was shot and killed in 1915. Hillis isn't buried in this cemetery. He's buried at the Lone Pine Cemetery, but I can't find the location. But Hillis was wrapped up in the Swafford-Tallet feud. See, Aaron Swafford was a Union bushwhacker who had already tortured and killed the elderly patriarch of the Tallet family in 1863. And then towards the end of the war in 1865, Hillis McVeigh Dunn catches this Union bushwhacker Swafford sleeping with his wife. Well, naturally, he says, "Get off my property, I don't want to see you here again, and if I do, I'll kill you." Well, later that night, Aaron Swafford comes back, pokes his rifle through the window of Hillis McVeigh Dunn, and shoots him in front of his wife and daughter. Now, naturally, this caused a rift between both the Tallet and the Dunn family against the Swaffords. So decades later, when the man's grandson hears that he can go arrest one of them for moonshining, he jumps on it. You can understand, however, how he might be a little bit too quick with the revolver, and you can understand how Eastland Swafford would have probably wanted to get the first draw on him, knowing he might be shot dead without provocation. Now, only a couple days later, this deputy's friend, a man named J.M., was gunned down in this very cemetery, attending his funeral by his own son-in-law, Ben Hamilton. See, the Hamilton family around this county were well known as moonshiners and general lawbreakers. They weren't totally nefarious, but usually people would shy away from them. So naturally, J.M. Roberts was a little bit perturbed when he found out his daughter had married Ben Hamilton, a man who had a reputation for being a bit mentally off. And eventually his daughter decided to divorce the man, and he ended up in an asylum for a short period of time. Now, as soon as he was let out, he went back to J.M. Roberts' house, the house of his father-in-law, and begged to have his ex-wife back. J.M. said, "No, you better just get off my property and let bygones be bygones." So Ben Hamilton pulled out a revolver and said, "I demand my wife back." J.M. de-escalated the situation very calmly, walked up to his former son-in-law and said, "Don't throw your life away, son," and snatched up the revolver. Ben Hamilton, who was already unhinged, was very put off by this. He felt that J.M. had slighted him and held a grudge for a period of time up until he saw J.M. at the funeral of his own buddy, another deputy from the Bledsoe County Sheriff's Department. Ben Hamilton pulls out his revolver and shoots him in front of a crowd of people. And it's a very large crowd because naturally you have a large turnout when a deputy is shot trying to apprehend a suspect. Everybody witnessed this, but miraculously, Ben Hamilton managed to escape and made his way to Idaho. He next shows up 13 years later. When folks call him the bad man of the Big Hole Basin, he's already killed 3 law enforcement officers out there, and a lynch mob of 300 people tracks down bad Ben Hamilton to a remote cabin in the woods, burning it down and tying him to a tree. Eventually, his body would be brought back here to his home of Bledsoe County, but it lies without a gravestone in a potter's field. The Swafford family accounts for quite a few deputies and even sheriffs of Bledsoe County, and before we talk about the 1932 ambush and assassination of Sheriff T.J. Swafford, we need to wind back the clock to 1930 and talk about Thomas Young, or T.Y. Swafford, who was sheriff at the time. Now, apparently, he was dining at a cafe owned by a W.A. Banks. This cafe was highly desirable and attached to the Bledsoe County Courthouse. Well, apparently, Thomas Young dropped his revolver, and when it hit the floor, it blew the top of W.A. Banks's head right off. Now, the store later passed into the hands of T.J. Swafford, who retained it for a few years and was assassinated right in front of the same cafe on October 11th, 1932. What's more, in December of 1943, 65-year-old Thomas Young Swafford died a mysterious death of his own. He was found on the 22nd frozen to death atop a mountain. He had no car to get up there. It seems like someone drove him up a dirt road and left him for dead. He'd been trying to make a fire, but he froze to death overnight right before Christmas. Thomas Young Swafford actually isn't buried in the cemetery over here. He's buried about 10 minutes over in this direction on private property. But we're here at the Swafford Chapel Cemetery to look at some of the tombstones because the stories they tell lay out bloody Bledsoe and the feuding of the 1930s. We're sitting now next to the grave of Sheriff T.J. Swafford, who was assassinated in an ambush October 9th, 1932, at the height of Bloody Bledsoe. In fact, this murder is still unsolved, and it happened right in front of the courthouse. Now, he was killed because the restaurant he owned had sort of been gotten through ill-gotten means from somebody else that was attached to that courthouse. And to this day, it's unsolved. It's truly a fascinating case of just the height of murders in Bledsoe County. So again, buried next to me is Sheriff Thomas James Swafford, born 1892, assassinated 1932. There were two competing theories as to what could have been the motivation. The first theory proposed in the papers was that a local couple had been murdered. Their home was burned down, their charred bodies were found, and that was the murder case of Ease Walker. Perhaps the sheriff was investigating a little bit too hard. The other theory is that W.L. Tullett, the son that I was talking about of the feudist leader who was killed in 1905, the trustee of the sheriff, and the sheriff, they were both Democrats. Now, the county Republicans had opened up a corruption case and implicated both men. Shortly after this, he was gunned down. He was hit 5 times, one of them severed his spine, and he would die several days later on October 11th. And the sun is setting over this county and some of the earliest Swafford pioneer graves. These are very unique to Appalachia. I've said in the past that they're reminiscent of graves in the Highlands of Scotland and in Wales, but apparently they have no real common ancestor. They're a totally unique grave style. On August 3rd, 1934, a crowd had gathered near the Bledsoe County Courthouse to listen to election results. By all accounts, and many people saw this happen, a man named Ralph Hamilton walked up, pulled out his revolver, and shot 26-year-old Coy Sutherland, who was very friendly with the Swafford family. In fact, he's now buried surrounded by Swaffords at the Swafford Chapel and Cemetery, and was a close ally of the previous sheriff. Now, although many people saw this happen, it seems like he must have either escaped, he was arrested the following day, or he was not charged, he was acquitted, because several years later he would be found guilty of another murder and Hamilton would be sent off to prison for 15 years. Now, the tragedy for the Sutherland family did not end there, because as we know, Coy Sutherland was killed in August of 1934, but wind forward the clock until 1954, when his 19-year-old son, Coy Burton Sutherland, was ambushed and killed. It would be another 2 years before 3 brothers and a stepbrother from the Smith family were brought in for questioning, and it was pretty obvious that they had murdered him. It's a sad fact of reality that the women of these Appalachian family feuds are often overlooked. Now, the story here is with Ada Swafford, who married into the Sutherland clan and formed a close-knit alliance between them. In 1934, her husband was killed, and then 19 years later, her very young son was killed. Now, the story involved with that, apparently the Smith family had a dog that got loose from their farm and got onto the Sutherland land. The dog got inside of the chicken coop and began rooting around and killing all the chickens, and that is when Howard Sutherland comes out to go shoot the dog. When one of the Smith boys goes to protect the dog, Howard apparently shoots the boy. Now, the Smith boy was fine, but he was very gravely wounded, and the Smith family immediately filed a lawsuit. However, at that time, a lot of Swaffords were in places of power within the county government, and although the Sutherland family was their surname, the wife was born a Swafford. So they pretty immediately revoked those lawsuits, and a short time later, the murder of Coy Sutherland, the son of Ada Swafford Sutherland, was also perpetrated, most likely by the Smith boys, avenging their brother who they felt might die. The evidence against the Smith family was only circumstantial, so what it amounted to is basically someone saw them all conspiring and talking in Pikeville, Tennessee. It looked like they had an attitude of conspiracy And that's all it really amounted to. Now, in spite of the bad blood between the families, they did bring these boys in, but eventually had to let them go, and they were acquitted of the murder. Now, was this because of a dog, or did it have anything to do with the family ties, the ties to the Swaffords that the Sutherland clan had here in Bledsoe County? And you can see some of these Sutherland graves here. Howard Ross Sutherland only died in 2014, but he was the man that shot at the Smith family kid, and they were apparently angry over that and killed his brother Coy Sutherland in 1954 when he was only 19 years old, and his father was killed in the election of 1934 in Bloody Bledsoe. In November 1939, Major T. Hamilton's son, Kenneth, was found dead in the woods, his throat apparently cut so deeply that it nearly beheaded him. Officially, that murder is still unsolved, but a week later, his other son, Richard Hamilton, went out and ambushed and murdered a taxi driver. Apparently, he asked to be driven back home, and then in front of his own house, he murdered the man. Now, that son was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and I think that he might have had an inkling of an idea who had killed his brother at the time he was killing the cabbie. And there is the father, Major Hamilton. Over here are the Sutherlands, two of whom were also killed in Bloody Bledsoe, and Kenneth Hamilton, who was found murdered in the woods in November 1939. Another of Major Hamilton's sons to die early was Richard Gordon Hamilton, who was killed right before Christmas 1937, a couple years before his brother, Kenneth Hamilton. And here we are, up over the ridge in Bloody Bledsoe County. I'd like to tell you the story of John Keedy, who's buried here at the Bethel Cemetery. Keedy was a part of a very large family here in Bledsoe County with nearly a dozen brothers and sisters, and in May of 1901 his wife decided to run away to live in the cabin of another man by the name of Stanton McWilliams. It seems like John got drunk, had a little bit of liquid courage, and took the hour-long hike over to the McWilliams cabin, demanding to see his wife. When Stanton said, "You'd better get off my land, you're trespassing," according to him, John got belligerent, so Stanton shot him, killed him, and was acquitted by reason of self-defense. Now, only 4 years later, in 1905, Stanton McWilliams was killed by Charles Buchanan, and Charles was acquitted by reason of self-defense. These were some of the feuds that were wrapped up in Bloody Bledsoe. Family disputes, wives, liquor, bootlegging, fights with the sheriff, fights with the deputies. Bloody Bledsoe claimed many, many dozens of lives. By the way, John Keedy is buried here between these two trees on the left side, but if we pan over, you can see, like many cemeteries in Appalachia, this is basically the Keedy family cemetery. There's other families in here, but you can see there Maggie and Frank Keedy, Frank born in 1884, and the Wilburns are a very numerous clan here in Appalachia. And if you're going to visit the grave of John Keedy, I'd like you to also pay your respects here to a young man, Ricky Lee Hitchcox, who served with the Dunlap Volunteer Fire Department and in 1982 made the ultimate sacrifice.